shorebirds in Western Australia, basically kind of from about Esperance running the whole around the bottom. You get a few thousand stints here and there, and a few curlew sandpiper and a few other bits and pieces. And then once you sort of get to the vast Wanderup region, which is sort of near Margaret River, if you've heard of Margaret River before, that's when you start to get these really nice freshwater wetlands. And that's where the shorebird numbers start to pick up. So
right.
South of Perth, you've got the Peel Yargarup system, and then you've got the vast Wanderup system. And those are the two really big shorebird areas in the southwest.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Birding Today podcast. I'm your host, Guillaume Doerig, and this is a podcast where we celebrate and discuss the joy of birding, as most of you know by now, hopefully. So thanks for being here as always. I'm going to start off with the listener shout-out segment. So this week's listener shout-out goes to Stephen Pepayat from the UK. So that was nice to get someone from the UK, who emailed in saying, I just found your YouTube site and have really enjoyed your shows, even if we are a world apart. And just wanted to say thanks for producing it. Thank you, Stephen, for listening and watching. It's really encouraging, and it's great to have you with us. So today's guest is an exciting one. I say that for every guest, but it's because I'm excited for every guest. So today's guest lives in Perth, where he works for BirdLife as the Western Australian Shorebird Coordinator. He grew up in the bushy outer suburbs of Brisbane and completed a Bachelor of Science in Ecology at the University of Queensland. In 2012, he commenced a PhD in mammal conservation with the Australian Wildlife Conservancy at the Scotia Sanctuary, but was based in an ornithology lab at UQ at the same time. While already an avid birdwatcher, this consolidated his interest in birds, and he started taking part in additional field projects, such as monitoring Moreton Bay shorebirds and surveying arid zone birds in South Australia. Sounds like a dream. At this point, he also got into Twitchathons and formed the team Hear No Weebill, See No Weebill. Brilliant. That's got to be one of the best names. After finishing his PhD, he moved to Hawaii for 2 years, working in the mountains of Oahu, conducting feral pig monitoring. He returned to Australia and moved to Perth in his current role, which involves coordinating citizen scientists, training and public outreach workshops, and collaborating with state government and NRM groups to develop their shorebird monitoring programs. So please welcome Jeremy Ringma on the show. How are you doing, Jeremy? Thanks for coming on.
Hi, Guillaume. Thanks for having me on.
No problem at all. It is exciting, like I said at the beginning, because this is, I was going to say, most of the podcast is focused a little bit more on East Australian birding. So I was quite happy to have you on because, but before we get into that, let's start at the basics of the podcast, which is the joy of birding. What do you think brings you joy in birding? What's the thing that brings you the most joy?
I think it's just something that I just have. It's this nice little stable thing throughout my life. So like no matter what I am, where I am, what I'm doing, I always have birds. And this can be, you can be in the middle of the city, you can be in the middle of nowhere in the bush. It's always something that once you sort of get the birding bug, it's something that you just have in your life. So it's just this little extra nugget, a bit of icing on the cake for whatever activity that you happen to be doing. So yeah, that's what I get the joy from birding from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's like a stable thread through your life, isn't it? Whatever happens to you, good or bad, you always have the birds to go back to. It's almost like a comfort thing, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, and I think over last 20 plus years when I've been sort of into birds, and you go through little phases where you're like, I'm really into birds at the moment, and I've got goals, and I want to see this, and I want to go here, and other times it's like I'm just going to go for a walk in the park and just see what's there, but it's always something that's in the background there that you've got once you sort of get into it. So yeah,
that's right. Yeah, and it can always grow, can it? And that's why I love it. So varied, and it's almost as varied as like our own lives. So the birds are a reflection of how varied we humans are as well, I think, in a way. And talking about that, you grew up in Brisbane. And so tell me a little bit about how you started birding and how you got interested in birds, because Brisbane's a great place to start, isn't it?
Brisbane's an amazing city for bird watching. I would rank it highly as far as all the cities I've visited in Australia. I think it's right up there. I might be completely biased because I grew up there, and I think probably everybody would say has a soft spot for where they grew up. But in terms of sort of sheer diversity, species diversity, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a city with more, a capital city in Australia with more species. Like even when you start talking about Darwin, even Cairns and Townsville probably has slightly more, but it's like the accessibility with Brisbane. So there's my PhD supervisor, Richard Fuller, did a local big year where he just took the Brisbane CBD, the Brisbane council area map, and he sort of set himself this big year challenge where he wasn't going to count birds outside of that area, and he got 298 species.
Wow.
So it's just a crazy number. Yeah, and this is all within 15, 20 minutes driving from his house. So, and I think he's since then kept that list going, and he's well into the 300s now. So, yeah, even somewhere like Cairns or Townsville, I think you'd be on par or struggling to sort of break that sort of number. So, yeah, it's the habitat diversity there in such a short distance, I think is, so you can go from intertidal mudflats to mangroves to Melaleuca swamp to lowland rainforest to highland rainforest, all in the course of an hour of driving. So that's what I think really makes Brisbane special.
Absolutely, and that's what would have contributed to your, when you were first starting out. Like, were you quite young when you started? Like, how old were you when you first got into it?
I don't think I associated with being an actual bird watcher until I was in undergrad, but I was definitely bird watching since I was a kid. Like, because it was one of those. I didn't really know anybody who was a bird watcher until I went to uni. But I think one of my first memories of birding was on this camping trip that we used to go on, and so every Easter we'd go into the Toowoomba Ranges next to stay on a friend's property near Ravensbourne National Park, and there was whipbirds calling all the time, and we'd never see them. And I can remember I would have been about 6 or 7. And my dad said to me, well, if you want to see it, you have to get up early in the morning when nobody else is walking around. So I did. I woke up before it was light, and I, as like a 7-year-old, crawled out of the camp and sort of sat next to this big patch of lantana, which I'd been hearing them. So like I think that's probably one of my first memories of actually like chasing a bird as a kid, and then sort of took off from there, I think.
Amazing. Yeah, it's those early memories are so important as well. Like they kind of form what you're going to do for the rest of your life in a way, and not only in birding but in your whole life. When you have these early experiences, you always remember them, and there's a place for them. That's awesome. So I also wanted to, like, as we said at the beginning, that WA is kind of strangely different in a way from the East Coast. I did a bit of research. Just Googling some numbers, and it's interesting because I want to touch on the population. So the population of WA is just over 2.6 million, right? And if you combine Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, the eastern states together, that's almost 10 times that. That's about 20 million. And so, and maybe that's why there isn't as much talk about WA birding, because maybe there's just less people there and less birders. What do you think about that, about those figures? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, there are a lot of bird watchers here. The Southwest, I think the other thing to remember about WA is that you have the Southwest region, and then you've got the Gascoyne and the Pilbara, which is just desert. And then you've got Broome and the Kimberley. So you have this big chunk through the middle, which is basically, it's not very hospitable for human settlement. And there's some amazing wildlife there. But that's really, you've got this focus of the northeast and then the southwest, and the rest of the state is just split by this big desert region. So yeah, the bird watching scene is kind of split as well with people, and people will, from the Perth-based birders will make like pretty regular pilgrimages up into the Kimberley region to get those birds. So, but yeah, just the sheer numbers of the population over east. And you're saying that, as you were saying, like the east coast, you've got Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria. It's basically the same surface area as all of Western Australia. So yeah, it's very, very polarized kind of region of Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but that's not to say that it's not a birding hotspot, because you have, you know, for one, you have all the endemics, like on the southwest endemics, like they're definitely national targets, and indeed international targets for bird watchers. It's like
definitely, definitely, and they can be picked up. So there's an area in called Shane's Beach, and you've got the 3 skulking species, and this is the draw card. Everybody who's gone to southwest Western Australia, and they've tried to get all of the endemics, they all know this one area. So there's these little nuggets scattered around the place, but you can realistically, I think that if you think about sort of like the twitchathons that I was doing in Queensland, and if you compare it, I've done one twitchathon when I first moved over here, and then the pandemic kind of shut down twitchathons for a couple of years. Hopefully they'll kick off again this year. But a good number in Perth, based in Perth, is maybe 150, 160 species, whereas Brisbane 220, 230 was what we were sort of shooting for. So the overall species diversity here is a lot lower, but the endemism is high. And when you start thinking about natural history in Perth, it's not really just about the birds. It's this wildflower hotspot. It's got really good reptile diversity. So yeah, often when you live here for 12 months, and you'll probably pick up most of the things that are here bird-wise, but then that's not where your journey doesn't stop there. It sort of builds sort of this love of this location. So hey, Fluff.
Look, oh, I love
get
it.
on your mat.
I love it. Yeah, no, but absolutely. Like, and also taking into account the whole state, like you said, there's this whole chunk of desert, but like that's some of the most pristine habitat in the whole country. Like, it's so untouched and remote. Like, you know, that's where you get your princess parrots, like, you know, grey honey eaters, all these amazing inland specialists that are there as well. So yeah, WA is definitely a target for me. I've never been there, but yeah, so much to talk about. Yeah, when you get into the Pilbara, so I haven't seen grey honeyeater. That's sort of a bit. It's not a bogey bird because I haven't really chased it properly. I've been in its habitat a couple of times, but I haven't put the hours into sight, and it's eluded me per se. But yeah, there's now that the grass wren taxonomy has been revised, we've now got quite a few grass wren species that sort of are scattered about throughout the Gascoyne and the Pilbara region as well. So there's some bonus endemics, if you so to speak, in those desert regions. Princess parrot. There's now that the calls have been released for night parrot. There's probably just as many night parrot populations in Western Australia as there is in the rest of Australia. That's known now. So I think there's about 3 or 4 night parrot populations here that are like established and known, and there's potentially more. I said it's relatively intact desert habitat in a lot of places, and then you get out to these super remote regions. There's this stretch called the Canning Stock Route, which is this sort of 4-wheel drive adventure that goes from the Tanami Desert south. I'd love to do that at some day. I think that's unfortunately my 4-wheel drive is a little bit old, and it's doesn't have as much go as it did 10 years ago. So at some point I'll get a new, better 4-wheel drive, and I'll give that one a go. But I think it's about 1,500 kilometers or something like that, and that's where princess parrots are, and no one really goes there because it's just so remote. Yeah, no, those places are just incredible, like, and you've got to be really well prepared lest something happen to you,
Yeah,
but yeah, for sure. And moving now towards the kind of the oceanic habitats and the shorebirds and the coast.
yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that and what you do for the shorebirds in the BirdLife Shorebird Project of WA. So what's
Yeah.
your role? What's your role with that?
Right. So there's the Shorebird program within BirdLife is kind of the epicenter of it is split within two locations. So we have our sort of Melbourne-based office, and a lot of our programs are based around the Melbourne office because that's the national office. But then you've also got Broome, that's shorebird, the epicenter of shorebirds in Australia, really, to the Broome Bird Observatory, 80 Mile Beach, that area. There's just crazy numbers of shorebirds there. So if you ever get a chance, even in the middle of winter, the number of birds that overwinter there is mind-blowing, let alone the numbers that you get in the actual migration. So those are traditionally those two locations where a lot of focus has been on shorebirds in Australia. But from a BirdLife perspective, we set up this role about 2 or 3 years ago to have a Perth-based project coordinator, and that is now thinking about Western Australia. So the role was to look at the rest of Western Australia, because there's a lot more of Western Australia than just Broome, and cumulatively, while Broome is a hotspot, and there's probably the same number of shorebirds in Broome as there is in the rest of Western Australia combined, that's still a heap of shorebirds. That's still 200,000 shorebirds. So the point of that was they're a bit more spread out. They're in their hundreds and thousands rather than in their tens and hundreds of thousands sort of numbers, but it's spread out over the entire coast of Western Australia. So shorebirds in Western Australia, basically kind of from about Esperance running the whole around the bottom, you get a few thousand stints here and there, and a few curlew sandpiper and a few other bits and pieces. And then once you sort of get to the vast Wannerup region, which is sort of near Margaret River, if you've heard of Margaret River before, that's when you start to get these really nice freshwater wetlands. And that's where the shorebird numbers start to pick up. So south of Perth, you've got the Peel Yargarup system, and then you've got the vast Wannerup system, and those are the two really big shorebird areas in the southwest. And those areas are going through quite dramatic land use change at the moment. There's a lot of agricultural expansion in that region. And because there's that agricultural expansion in the region, and the water use is changing, and these wetlands, the hydro periods in these wetlands are changing really rapidly. So that's the point of that project, is there's more wetlands and shorebird areas to survey than any one person has time to do. So we need citizen scientists to go out and survey them. And people have been doing this. They've been doing this sort of almost on their own steam since the 80s. But what that lacks is coordination. And what we've got now is we've got this data set which has a whole bunch of issues with it. So it has, you'll sample a spot for 2 or 3 years and there'll be a gap for 4 years, and then somebody did some sampling at that spot and they were doing it a certain way, and then so that's the point of the coordinator role, is to get everybody doing roughly the same thing at the same time, increasing recruitment, getting more people out to do surveys, and making sure that these important surveys are being done at the right time. So
absolutely, and I guess the key to getting valuable and accurate data is consistency, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
So consistency both in area and the timing in which it occurs. So we do something. So BirdLife's shorebird monitoring program ties in with the Asian waterbird census. So every year throughout all of Australia, we try to, roughly towards the end of January, we try to survey every single area which is important for shorebirds, or within within what's feasible to do that. And we sort of recruit volunteers and coordinate volunteers to go out towards the end of January and do these census counts. And that's sort of in our Birdata portal. If you go in and look at the Explore or look at shared sites in the Shorebirds protocol, then you'll see all of these little polygons drawn in around all these lakes all around Australia. There's about 2,500 shorebird survey sites throughout Australia, and that is what we try to count at least once a year.
And so how do you go about recruiting volunteers? Like if someone's watching or listening to our conversation, what would they have to do maybe if they were keen to contribute?
Yeah, so the first thing depends on where you are. So your bird watching club, your local BirdLife branch or local bird watching club may already have well-established coordinated surveys. So start by checking out what's happening in your local area. So for in Brisbane, that's the Queensland Wader Studies Group. In Perth, that's the BirdLife branch. If you're in Melbourne, then you're going to be talking to the Shorebird program there. So start by talking to somebody at your BirdLife branch and see what's already happening. And then you can get on, we've got a number of different Facebook pages. So there's the Australian Wader Studies Group, which coordinate a lot of the banding. And then we've got an East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership Facebook group. We've got a BirdLife Western Australia Facebook group. So the Facebook groups are all a great way to do it. And then you can also sort of email myself or anybody within BirdLife directly. If you were to send an email to somebody anyone within BirdLife, they'd soon quickly forward us on and would get your contact details. So that's the various different pathways to doing it. But also, you don't have to be, if this is more about the coordinated efforts, you can just hop onto Birdata, do a bit of a skim through what the Shorebird protocol is, and you can go out and just do it all by yourself. So we do this coordinated effort every single summer, but that doesn't mean that you can't do one other months of the year as well. So if you just want to go down to your local spot, and if you think you're good enough to do a count for shorebirds and identify the species with relatively high confidence and do counts with relatively high confidence, then yeah, just hop onto Birdata and do a shorebird survey protocol.
Excellent. Yeah, that's brilliant. I'll put your email address if you like in the description and the show notes, and people can write to you because it's a brilliant kind of project, and it's national. It's not only national because, as you say, you have to work with also international entities in order to kind of track the migrations. Because that's the wonderful thing about birds is that they don't see the political or geopolitical borders. And that's reflected in the international relationships of these organizations like BirdLife and so to zoom it back down to you, Jeremy, it takes a lot of effort, right, to do all this. So you must be quite passionate about shorebirds. Are they your favorite group of birds?
They're definitely one. This will be a common theme for you throughout this podcast. I'm really terrible at favorites. I definitely know that I like some things more than other things. But I mean, I have a colleague who works with me, Lyndall Kidd, and she definitely, shorebirds are her favorite birds. Like irrefutably, they're her favorite birds. I highly rank shorebirds, but I mean, are shorebirds better than raptors? Are shorebirds better than albatross? I really struggle. I have existential crises trying to define which ones are better. So yes, I highly rank them. Yeah, that's my diplomatic answer.
For sure, and we'll come on. We'll touch on this at the end with your favorite bird question. But for now, you touched on the best sites, to do counting, like Broome. You've got the Western Treatment Plant in Melbourne, which is incredible as well. What are some maybe less well-known ones that are still really good for shorebirds nationally?
Yeah, I mean, right now, if you're in Perth, Lake McClarty is going off. So we had a very, very wet winter. We've had the wettest winter in nearly 30 years. And unlike Brisbane and Sydney, which gets most of its rainfall happening in summer monsoonal storm systems, Perth is a little bit more like Melbourne, where it gets that winter rain come through, and that sort of defines why it's the agricultural area that it is. So like the wheat belt in Perth is a winter rainfall. They sow in April, May, and then come September, October, then they harvest, and then we get no rain for 4 or 5 months. It's so dry, it's ridiculous. Very like a massive ecological shock for me coming over here, and it's we had 5 days over 40 degrees in Perth over Christmas, which is the first time that's ever happened. Brisbane, you'd crack 40 degrees like once or twice during the summer, but the humidity would be through the roof, and then you'd get these big summer storms every other day. So for me, coming over here and being like, what do you mean all the frogs come out in winter? That doesn't make any sense. They should be out in February. So that's, it's climatically super different. I think I've massively tangented from the actual question, which was where are the best shorebird spots? So yes, Lake McCluddy, which is about an hour and a bit south of Perth. That's a massive wetland. It's in the Pilyaga Upper Ramsar site. And that has received probably closer to what we'd say historically normal amounts of water. And it's now been drying. And then mid-January, it started to get some mud exposed on the edge.
Wow.
And now the shorebirds have started to come through. So there's 15 to 20,000 birds on it right now. Probably about 10 plus thousand are various different waterfowl. But then we've also got a whole bunch of shorebirds coming in at the moment, and we're getting long-toed stint, pectoral sandpiper, curlew sandpiper. Then I think people quite regularly see ruff there as well. What else has been something else? A double-banded plover showed up, which is normally it's a East Coast migrant from New Zealand, and one of them popped up a couple of weeks ago. John Graff probably, if not 100% confirmed, but very plausibly saw a little stint there 2 or 3 weeks ago. So that's sort of like the number one shorebird spot within the Perth area as of right now. But these lakes, there's a string of these lakes that run south from Perth, and depending on what's drying when and where the mudflat is, any one of these lakes could be booming at any particular moment. So that's sort of like a really popular activity for hardcore bird watchers and shorebirders in Perth, is to go hit up these lakes as they dry and see what's moved into the area.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's in those places, you know, where there's such a huge gathering of shorebirds that you get a huge percentage of the vagrants that Australia has recorded, you know, like, because there's so many birds that come together that you know, there's always something really special there, or very often. Yeah. Little Stint is a great example of that, because shorebirds have this reputation of being difficult to ID. I kind of agree and disagree. I think the biggest problem with shorebirds is people don't have a spotting scope. If you were to say, how do you tell a great knot from a red knot? Sure, that's relatively difficult, but it's not that much more difficult from, say, telling what a white-naped honeyeater is compared to a white-throated honeyeater. There's only 1 or 2 little differences, but it's sort of accepted that like reasonably decent bird watchers will be able to tell those species apart. But you'd say, take a bird watcher of maybe the same experience and then throw some shorebirds at them, and they're like, oh, that's too hard. And it's often because people just don't have the optics that's appropriate for actually seeing out 100 or so meters to actually get a decent look at those birds. So, fluffhead, come here. I see what you mean about the IDing, yeah, because, and this is interesting because you know, I come from Europe, and European birding is so much more focused on telescopes and scopes than it is here. You know, that's something that I remember. You know, like you'd always have someone with their scope on the back like that. You know, or very often anyway. And so maybe that's a difference that you see here, like that people aren't as confident maybe with the shorebirds, or they don't have the optics, as you say. It's a really interesting point. Yeah.
I think if you were to take the average Australian bird watcher, they're going to have a pair of binoculars, and they're going to have probably, so the 99% of the time they're going to have a pair of binoculars on them, and then half of the time they're going to have a camera of some description hanging off them as well. And only a fraction of the time you see somebody walking around, even in a wetland, to actually have people walking around with a spotting scope, where they're arguably they're most useful. But once I got a spotting scope, I bought one when I was in Queensland, and I used them. I would take it with me all the time. When you're dealing with like really tall canopy, come on, Fluff. When you're dealing with really tall canopy, 40, 50 meter canopies in rainforest, having that ability, like you've got a rose crowned fruit dove in the top of a strangler fig, you pay dividends having a spotting scope with you.
Wow, really? I thought you were going to go like, oh, it's too hard when you're in a closed environment, and like a rainforest, and like I would think that's more difficult to kind of put the scope on it. Do you disagree?
Yeah, often it's so often, remember, so you're using binoculars and you're looking up the whole time, so you'll give yourself warbler neck, but also the ability. So the spotting scope with an angle, you can look up in there. It's great for if you're taking people who haven't been bird watching that much, so coming along with you, and they're just going to struggle to get onto something in some rainforest canopy, and now it's almost like the clutter. It's like if you're in a more open habitat, you can be like, it's that tree over there, and it's the third branch along, and go 2/3 of the way up. But when there's 1,000 tree branches, that's not particularly useful. Right. So sometimes it's easier just to put it in the middle of a spotting scope, and like that's where it is. And the magnification, if you've got a small bird sitting in the canopy, not doing all that much, not moving all that much, then it can be hard to get on to with a pair of 8 or 10 power binoculars. But if you've got 25 or 30 power, which is much more powerful, better light transmission coming. Remember, like if you've got a good spotting scope, it's got a much bigger front optic, and it's letting a lot more light in than binoculars too. So they're very much underutilized, and that's kind of I think people in Australia don't value spotting scopes as an optic, and as a consequence, you'll see someone with a pair of Swarovskis and then $10,000 worth of camera hanging off them, and then you're like, oh, you should spend $2,000 on a spotting scope, and they're like, oh, why would I do that? That doesn't make any sense. But I think that's one of the main reasons why people find shorebirds hard, is they just don't have that scope.
Yeah, for sure. I want to just quickly close that segment, but just with this final question: why do you think that scopes don't catch on in Australia?
I think you probably can only carry so many things with you while you're bird watching, and I've tried to do binoculars, scopes, and camera before, and it's not a winner. It's definitely not. It's not a long-term sustainable solution. So having I think people like to photograph birds. So if people are given the choice between identifying a shorebird and maybe getting a really nice photo of a spotless crake, then they're going to go for the nice photograph. But I think maybe it's sort of like the scarcity of scopes means that people don't see the benefit in them so much. Because if all of your gun bird watchers, all of your blokes in the guys and gals in the 7+100 club, I bet they've all got a scope. So it's a rookie error. Get a scope, not a camera.
I love it. Awesome. You should put that on a t-shirt. Yeah, for sure. Australia as a whole is really an amazing place for birding, but I know that you've also birded overseas a lot, and a place that especially fascinates me that you've been to is Hawaii for your work. And tell me what's the birding like there? I mean, I've researched a little bit of the Hawaiian bird life, and this crazy stuff like the honey creepers and these weird families. Like, tell me what's the birding like in Hawaii?
The birding in Hawaii is simultaneously amazing and incredibly depressing, because you go to Hawaii, and so I lived on Oahu. So Hawaii is an archipelago. There's a chain of islands. So Oahu is where the giant US military naval base is, and that's sort of the established main island of Hawaii, and that only has a few species of native birds, of native bush birds left. So you have amakihi, elapaio, and apapane. It used to have iwi, but no one's seen one since the 90s. You get some pueo, which is a type of owl, so short-eared owl. And you have to, I've scoured Oahu. I've covered most of the trails there for work, and it's very difficult to find decent native vegetation. So Oahu is pretty depressing, but then you can get onto some of the other islands, some of the sort of off the beaten tourist trap areas, and to get onto Maui, get onto Kauai, get onto Big Island. So Hawaii, the largest island in Hawaii is called Hawaii. So instead of, to avoid confusion, everyone just calls it Big Island. So Big Island has amazing bird watching. So if you go halfway up Mauna Kea, which is the tallest, there's 3 volcanoes on Big Island. There's Kilauea, which is where the recent volcanic activity has been. And then you have Mauna Loa, and then you have Mauna Kea. Mauna Kea is the tallest one. And at about 2.5 kilometers, there's a reserve there called, I think it's called Hakalau. And that is crawling with birds. And that's like a little snapshot of what Hawaii was like a couple of hundred years ago. Yeah. So my favorite, you've got your honey creeper species. Evie is the one that I think is the one that everybody has probably seen the photos of when they think about honey creepers. It's like this vivid scarlet bird with a big downturned bill, and it's specifically evolved for nectar suckling. But that is that's not my favorite Hawaiian honey creeper. My favorite, I do actually have a favorite for this one. My favorite is the Akea pola owl, and that is a cross between a piculate and a rifle bird. So it's got this disproportionate upper and lower mandible. So the lower mandible is like a woodpecker, and then the upper mandible is this big, long, downturned probe. And it has the cranial morphology designed for actually chiseling and pecking the same way that a piculate or a woodpecker does, and it gets in under the bark of the it prefers ohia and koa. Those are the 2 large tree species on Hawaii. It gets in and it pecks away a section of bark and then probes in and pulls out the beetle larvae with its upper mandible. So that's a super cool bird. So the honey creepers are finches. They're from a group that are the rose finches, and they showed up 3 or 4 million years ago, and then they've just radiated from there. So
yeah, fascinating. So fascinating, man. Oh, there's so much to see of the world and the birds of the world. Like it's almost limitless. I mean, there's so much potential, and I know you've also birded in other parts of the world, and listeners will know that I'm interested in that, and the differences in the birding scene and culture and the birds themselves. So what are the differences between, for example, Hawaii or maybe some other place that you've birded with Australia? Can you think of any big differences in the birding?
So Australian bird watchers tend to be a bit more independent, and they tend to be a little, I think it's because Australia on the whole is quite an expensive place to go on holiday. So there seems to be a lot more independent. The idea that you would go like as an Australian resident go birding somewhere and actually hire a guide for a week is kind of blows the budget really quickly. So I think a lot of the birding tourism in Australia is people coming from overseas and then spending those big bucks on it. I've certainly done a lot of my bird watching. I haven't paid. I don't think I've paid a single guide in Australia, but I've gone to Colombia and we had guides most of the time, and that's just a cost. It's a cost thing. It's also, and I think it's common for. It's also like a sheer volume of species, right? So, like, if you go to Colombia and you're dealing with 2,000 species in the whole country, we went to Colombia and half self-guided. We went for about 2 or 3 weeks. Half of the time we were self-guiding, and then the other half of the time we had local guides. So yeah, when you get a guide, you can kind of go with a big birding company and have like a planned itinerary and then go along, and that's what you're doing. Or you can find a local guide. I don't speak Spanish, but my partner and my friend who I was traveling with do. So we found our sort of like point of contact, our first source of information, and then you would say to them, "Oh, we're going over here next. Do you have a friend or do you know somebody who can guide there?" And yep, and they give you your phone number, and in disjointed Spanish, you sort of coordinate a rendezvous point and rendezvous time, and then you go from there. And that's sort of how we hopped our way around Colombia for a couple of weeks, and we got about 450 species in a couple of weeks.
Wow.
Which is just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. It's considering we didn't know what we were doing for half the time as well. It's just a completely different feeling doing bird watching in that manner compared to if I go for a bird watching trip in Australia, the pace is backed off quite a bit more. You've got half a dozen targets at a given spot, and you kind of know that if you spend a couple of days, you're going to get them all. Where you go to like anywhere of these sort of montane regions it's like I've got 3 days here, and if I see 20% of what's here, I'll be happy, and then I'll move on to the next spot.
Absolutely, yeah. That's how high the numbers are, and it's all got to do, I suppose, with the biogeography and the richness of the habitat and the diversity of the birds. And yeah, I just think it's incredible. And when you're on these trips, this is another theme that's coming up that I really love is the camera binoculars dichotomy. Are you very camera centered, or do you prefer to kind of just be an observer, if you see what I mean?
I started off bird watching being camera centric. I had a long lens on a camera before I had a pair of binoculars, and I kind of got into bird watching via photography. I did quite a lot of photography in high school, and I did a darkroom development course when I was 15, and then about 18 months later, digital SLRs became mainstream. So that was a completely redundant skill. So very fun, but yeah, completely useless. So I was into photography first, and then started to get into wildlife photography, got myself a nice long lens, and then I birded primarily. And actually, as a beginner bird watcher, it's having a long lens on a camera is actually a really good way to learn, because you could almost indiscriminately just go through and photograph, or especially now that it's digital, you can photograph all the birds that you see. And if you've got a black-chinned honeyeater in a tree 100 meters away, and you're not good enough to ID that with a pair of binoculars, you can quite comfortably fire off a photo with a 400mm lens, crop in on it later and go, oh, I think that's something different. That was a different bird. So it's a good filter as well. It keeps you honest as well. When you retrospect, I can remember forming my list in my early 20s, and subsequently knowing a little bit better, and quite a few species just miraculously disappeared later to be seeked out a bit later on as well. So it's a good filter for a bit of self-regulation, and yeah, it's a good way to go back and learn later. But also probably more important, I think, is having bird apps on your phone that have calls. That's probably a better technological aid for developing your skills as a bird watcher than having that camera. So, but yeah, back to your initial question. Initially camera, and now it's binoculars.
Right.
And now it's binoculars, probably with a scope. And I've now gone down to a pair of 8x32s. I always used to be a 10x. I've got very steady hands. I could probably quite comfortably hold 12 or 15 powers without any trouble. But it's just a weight thing.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need to have high magnification if you've got a 60 power spotting scope with you. So it's a weight thing, having a pair of compact binoculars. I also do a lot of multi-day hiking as well. So you don't want a full size pair of Swarovski bricks with you when you're going to walk. When you're planning on walking 100 kilometers, then it's knocking 400 grams off for a pair of compact binoculars is a significant economy. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on something interesting that is also one of the topics that we had when we were emailing the details of the episode, which is I usually ask what tips would you have for young birders and new birders, but I think it could be interesting to look at it from what could an experienced and decades-long birder, what could someone like that do to encourage a young birder coming up? What can we do to encourage new birders, if anything? Like, do you have any ideas? Yeah.
I would go out and do a bird watching trip. I think that's the go get a couple of friends together, maybe, and like as an experienced bird watcher, you are the one who can maybe coordinate that trip. Take some young bird watchers bird watching somewhere special. I can remember when I was sort of in my fairly fledgling birding days, I went a couple of mentor sort of figures and they weren't that much older than me. They were 10 years older than me at the time. That's a huge difference in experience in bird watching terms. So I went out to Barra, which is a AWC property. At the time, it was yet to be purchased by AWC, but it's in central Queensland, and it's notorious for having this really high species diversity of arid zone birds, arid zone honeyeaters. It has big thickets of Eremophila, so in the right conditions, you can get so many different types of arid honeyeaters. It's kind of the closest semi-reliable location for grey falcon.
Oh, nice.
So I went out there with two bird watchers who were they had that 10 years of experience on me. So it's Chris Sanderson and Nick Lesberg, and they essentially I learned probably more in those 4 or 5 days than I had in sort of like 3 or 4 years leading up to that. So
that's incredible.
So Nick in particular, he is now working on the Queensland night parrot population. Worked as a bird guide in Central and South America for several years. So he really knew how to show people birds, and he often made it about having seen all those birds before. He was like one of these people who sort of puts themselves out there to show other people birds and teach people why. Not just show people birds, but it's like, this is why this bird is this bird by call or by whatever feature, and this is how you find it. So yeah.
It's amazing. I got stuck with what you said about how you learned more in 4 or 5 days than 2 or 3 years. And that just goes to show the power that experienced birders have, that is available to give to new people and new enthusiasts. So it's really important. Like if any experienced birders are listening, and I hope you are, then it's really good to kind of realize the power and maybe power is not the right word, but the potential for education that we all have as experienced birders. Yeah, that's a really good point.
I think experienced bird, and I think experienced birders and newer birders, some experienced birders might not necessarily have as good birding habits as well. So you might want to be, in terms of your ethics around bird watching. So I think if you're a new bird watcher, while it's excellent to have those sort of those people, it's also, you also want to make sure you're not picking up any bad habits at the same time as well. So like, yeah, find a especially, I think a good way of thinking about it is like call playback is always this controversial topic. So if you can find a bird watcher whose life list is not based on birds on call playback, for example, then that's going to be a significant step towards not having that thing to rely on. I'm not necessarily against call playback, but I've seen it get abused so many times that I think that it's something that you definitely want to be a more experienced bird watcher before you start to lean on that sort of thing. So and often it's counterproductive too. So this one example of when I was in Tasmania, and we went down to Bruny Island, and there's a section, I forgot what the name of it, there's a well-known stretch of bit of forest on the southern half of Bruny Island, and it's known for scrub tit and it's known for pink robin. And there were these international bird watchers from America. They had no idea what they were doing, but they really wanted to see a pink robin. And the gentleman was basically just walking up and down this 200 or 300 meter stretch of road with his phone out, and he was just blasting pink robin call the whole time. And he didn't see one because it was put off by him playing call constantly. So half an hour later after he left, and the pink robins came out. So
wow,
yeah. So this idea, that you'll see more, but you're better off learning what the call is yourself and listening for that bird. So that's where the power of smartphones with calls on them comes from. It's not the ability to do call playback. It's the ability to go, oh gosh, I'm out in this spot and I really want to see this species, but I've got no idea what it sounds like. And you rip out your phone and then you give yourself a little quick reminder about what it is. And now you know what you're out after, and that can make a huge difference.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's we mentioned this when we were emailing. We could go on for hours talking about all these different aspects. That's how rich birding is, and yeah, like also the controversial issues are also a big talking point, and that's something to keep in mind again for, as an experienced birder communicating with new birders as well, maybe. So there's so much to learn. There's so much to learn, and talking about smartphones and technology. Do you like eBird? Do you use eBird a lot?
I use eBird and I use Birdata. As a scientist, I use both of them because I'm an end user of that data set. I'm not a hyper diligent recorder on either of the two apps. So I use Birdata for work. I use eBird if I've gone out somewhere and I found something special and I think that might be something that other people want to see, then I'll throw up a list on eBird just as a mechanism for alerting other people. But in my day-to-day bird watching, so at the moment in particular, my sort of day-to-day bird watching is I'm taking the dog for a walk or I'm going for a run, and I'm just keeping like a mental list while I'm going on, and that's adequate for me. So yeah, I'm not necessarily going out with the intention of making a large list and seeing how many species that I can get while I'm actually out bird watching, or maybe I'll go camping for a couple of days, and I might make one or two lists while I'm camping, but I also might not. So yeah, so I'm definitely an end user of that data. I do create some of it, and I'm on the platform using it at the moment. So yeah, so I will go, maybe somebody wants to see something over there. I'll go see what's going on or what species have been recorded at this lake lately. and then I'll hop on both of those platforms. So
yeah, it's the availability of the data, isn't it? And that ties back to the Shorebird project, especially in WA, I guess, with there's so much data, and I guess that you can use eBird and Birdata to solidify kind of the conclusions that you can make from the data. So yeah, it's very varied, isn't it? The whole scene of the data. Yeah.
So they're fun to. The thing to remember is Birdata and eBird are, their interface is the same, sort of, so to speak. Like there's not an awful lot. There's like a little bit of formatting differences here and there, but if you are a fluent eBird user, you can pick up the Birdata app and you can be using it competently in a few minutes. But they're fundamentally different types of data that you're generating as a citizen scientist using those two different apps. So eBird is Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is based in America, and then it's this international bird data app sort of thing. Whereas Birdata is a Australia-specific app, and that ties back to BirdLife programs and BirdLife monitoring programs. And by design, it means that the data that you're recording in Birdata tends to be specific to BirdLife monitoring programs. So, not saying that eBird data isn't useful, but the Birdata data that you put into Birdata under a specific program has a very direct line of, the data is collected at point A, and then it goes directly to the end user, and it's going to be used for a specific program. Whereas eBird data, or even in Birdata, there's like a general bird survey protocol as well. That's kind of the usage of that is a lot broader and less defined. So the idea that you're going to go out and go bird watching for a couple of hours and create a list that vaguely, so the other things as well is people, when they are making a bird watching list for their morning birding activity, it tends to be a couple of hours. It might cover several kilometers, and then you'll put numbers and count data, but you can't really trust a count of birds that's happened over 2 hours when you've been walking for 3 kilometers. When as a scientist who is going, if you were to set up an experiment, for example, and said, here is a patch of bush, and I want to know what species occur in that area and what density are those birds in that particular patch of bush, you wouldn't collect data in the way that the average eBird user collects data. You would do something like, so you'd use something that's called distance sampling for starters. So that's sort of like the gold standard of density estimates. So you would say there is a bird, it is a golden whistler, and it is 20 meters away, and there are 2 of them. And then you'd go and do the same thing for every single bird would have a number and a distance, and you'd have multiple entries for each species, and that gives you that count density information. And you'd only do that for 5 or 10 minutes. So that's like one of the gold standards. You can do distance sampling transects as well, but that's the best way to generate species accumulation curves, is these short surveys and these density-based estimates. And none of the apps really have an interface to allow you to do that. BirdLife has a sort of easier to do but less precise way of doing it, which is a 2 hectare 20-minute count. And the idea being is that you have a defined area, so therefore you don't need to do distance sampling. In my experience, estimating what 2 hectares is very, very difficult. So yeah, there's just to eyeball a patch of bush and be like, oh, that's 2 hectares is unrealistic. But that's the sort of thing that when the Bird Atlas program, which is occurring in the 90s, which is a BirdLife program, which a large amount of sort of this basal citizen science data, which a lot of environmental decision making is based on these 2-minute 20 hectare counts.
Wow, yeah.
So what in many ways, what eBird has done specifically, because before eBird there was Eremea,
Yeah.
And then Aramea kind of got swallowed up by eBird in a nice way. eBird were like, hey, we want to launch our platform. We recognize that you already have a very similar platform here. Well, how do you feel about joining forces? So Aramea kind of got swallowed up by eBird. And then a few years later, BirdLife was like, we need to have our own data. We need to have our own system for recording data, because the way that eBird records data isn't necessarily consistent with our programs. So what Aramea and eBird did was they made this huge volume of data that's not specific to anything. So it's not being specifically collected for any one purpose, which is in the same time incredibly powerful, but also at the same time really frustrating.
Yeah, I guess it's user focused, isn't it? It's all about It's all about you, the eBirder, and your life list and where you've been. That's the impression I get, maybe, and it's not. Maybe it could be more focused towards. Do you see what I mean? Like it's very kind of personal for a lot of people, eBird, isn't it? It's all about
100%.
Yeah.
Yep. It's definitely, there's amazing scientific outputs that come from eBird data, but it's been made in such a way which is incredibly user friendly, and it's a way that people can essentially, like, I have an Excel spreadsheet, and I don't subscribe to any one taxonomy. I have my own. Actually, I have my friend's Russell's taxonomy. So it's the Young taxonomy of Australian birds, and that's what I use. And I let him decide what new splits he's accepting or not. So I have my own taxonomy, and I have my own lists on a spreadsheet. And I'm a bit old-fashioned like that, but it's a way of keeping track more rapidly of when species are being split and when they're being revised back and forth. But I think when you're dealing with, well, you've got to remember that eBird it's international, but it's American. It's Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and you have this really high density of bird watchers in America, and that is almost something that you would call big data. There's so much data that what you can do with the data that comes from America is, so like the experimental shortcomings of just having people going out and collecting data ad hoc are overcome by the sheer volume of it. So they almost don't have to do statistics. They don't almost have to not do statistics because they've got just this volume of data coming through. So when you see these papers coming out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology looking at tracking warbler migration as it goes up from Mexico into Canada, they're doing something that we would have to have 100 to 1,000 times more data being recorded in Australia before we'd have any opportunity of paralleling.
Yeah, it's the volume, isn't it? It's really incredible. All of this kind of leads to, like I was saying, the personal aspect of birding, like, and being a citizen scientist and a nature lover. You know, like there's so much that we can discuss around it. And I guess the ultimate question for a birdwatcher, Jeremy, is, what's your favorite bird?
What's my favorite bird? My favorite bird in Australia. I really like palm cockatoos. That's very cliche. I think probably a lot of people would say that. The three really rare raptors I love, so grey falcon, red goshawk, leatherwing kite. They're sort of very high on my list. Blue-faced parrotfinch. I love a good blue-faced parrotfinch. Yeah, I could probably go through. Black-chinned honeyeaters would be my favorite honeyeater. Yeah, I could run through all of the different families if you want to and pick one out that way. But they're so wide and varied. Cassowary. I went to North Queensland about 3 or 4 years, and that was like my big thing to see, was because I'd gone to cassowary habitat a few times and missed them by. There's a nice fresh cashew shit on the ground, and you're like, oh, I missed you by a couple of minutes. So, so to finally get a couple of them at Mission Beach was really good.
Yeah, beautiful.
So, yeah. And then seabirds as well. There's various different things you could. The little grey-faced storm petrels are a current recent favourite based on the project that I did. Sometimes it's just going out and seeing a bird in its natural habitat in abundance. And it can be a common thing as well. Like every single time I go out and see like a big flock of budgies, I'm like, oh, budgies are back up to the top of the list again.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a last bird you see that's your favorite, isn't it? It's that happens to me a lot, where you see an iconic bird, like, and for you, because of the experience of seeing it recently, and it's fresh in your memory, so you can kind of say, oh, that's a cool bird, And so what about what about a target bird, a dream bird that is next on your kind of needs list that you want to see?
I've got a few bogey birds in Australia that I need to get my butt back in gear and chase down. So my two biggest bogey birds are painted snipe and Lewin's rail, and these are all things that I've painted snipe in particular. They're a thing that I've like gone and twitched. So when people have reported them, and I've hopped in a car and driven out to spot them, and then I've missed them by minutes several times. Like not a one-off, like 3 or 4 times I've had that happen to me. Lewin's rails, I've probably found about 30 or 40 of them, and they've been a few meters away, and they've never actually stepped out of the grass. So those are sort of dream. I don't know whether they're dream birds, but they're high priority target birds. I'd love to go back to hopefully this year, that might be a reality. Last year we went to the Kimberley and we did the West Kimberley, but I first went to the Kimberley about 10, 15 years ago and picked up a bunch of species, but we were actually looking for reptiles when I did that. So the bird watching wasn't the number one priority, and anybody's both a herper and a birder, they'll attest to how those two activities are mutually exclusive often. So you go out, spotlight until 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, and then sleep in, and you're just like, there's no way that you can feasibly get a nice morning bird session in and herp every single night at the same time. So we spent a week on the Mitchell Plateau, and I didn't see a black grass wren.
Right. So
that's a dream bird. That's a target bird. I'd love to go to. Oh, this is probably going to skip over onto the next question, but I'd love to go to the Pantanal and see Isis macaw.
Yeah, man, for sure. The whole of tropical South America and Central America is incredible. I lived in Chile for a long time, and it's not tropical. Chile doesn't have a tropical region. But despite that, it's still really amazing birding, and you've got a high level of endemism in Chile as well. But yeah, once you get to Peru, Colombia, and sweeping up into Central America, you get this incredible diversity. But I think we're over time a little bit, but that's okay, because I've kind of let I used to be quite strict on the time of the podcast, but I think I shouldn't be. Like, I think you were the one that commented on one of my YouTube videos about just let it run and see what happens. Yeah,
just go. Yeah, so if I don't have enough time to listen to it, I'll press pause and pick it up later. Yep.
Yeah, for sure. So hopefully listeners can do that, and yeah, because a really good conversation does take time, and it takes time to unfold, and then you can go back to different topics that we discussed, and but it's been an absolute pleasure, Jeremy. Thanks so much. It's just you've been a wonderful guest.
Thanks, Guillaume. No, it's been great to have me on, and looking forward to more chats later in the future, and maybe even we'll come to Perth. I'll take you birding. We'll go look for all the endemic skulkers.
I'd love that. Well, actually, one of the target, when I think of WA, I always think about the red-capped parrot. What a bird! It looks. Oh, I'd love to see that.
Yeah, just comedic in its proportions. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like every time I see a photo of that, it's like, wow, one day. But yeah, so let's wrap up. Thanks so much, Jeremy, again, and I'll see you soon, hopefully. Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to or watching this episode of the Birding Today podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to stay up to date with the show, you can follow me on all my social media platforms. And if you want to take it a step further and support the show and also get some cool benefits, you can support me on Patreon as well. So again, thank you for listening or watching, and I'll see you in the next one.